So, John, I just wanted to sort of, this is really about careers and trying to uncover, people who I've met over the period who have been mentors and provided me advice, and I think have got much more experience than I have and probably forgotten more than I know. So it's always good to sort of introduce people like yourself to the community and get them to realise that you're out here, and for those people who are not initiated to the manufacturing sector, to give them some insight into, what a career in this industry looks like. And yours is probably different to some of the others that I've engaged with, because
probably a lot different, yeah.
you've had a wealth of experience, and you've been at the leadership of a lot of organisations, and also tried to help a lot of organisations as well. So maybe if you can, we'll start at the beginning just to get the narrative right, about, when you first started, where you started your career. What was the first thing you did?
Well, my first job was a week after I left school with a company called Babcock and Wilcox. Babcocks were boilermakers, and of course built many of the large power stations around Australia, which is all very controversial at the moment because they're coal-fired. So I was a cadet metallurgist and going to University of New South Wales part-time. That was a pretty miserable experience in so many ways, because I was working out well over 70 hours a week. I had no car, and so I changed jobs a couple of times to sort of make life a little easier, earn a little more money, and I ended up in the foundry game. I came to enjoy molten metal enormously. It's a fascinating area, and so I pursued that for quite a while, and then when I was in my late 20s I joined a company called Comalco. Some of the older audience members might remember Comalco, but these days it's been swallowed up by Rio Tinto's Alcan division, or Alcoa I should say. So I don't know whether Rio actually has an aluminium division anymore. But Comalco was a large company with probably, it must have been about 10,000 employees around Australia, and then they expanded into North America and bought out a group over there that was into smelting and then primary metal manufacturing. So it had some similarities to what we did here in Sydney at Yennora.
What, if I can just stop you for a second,
sure.
What made you choose metallurgy? Why that?
Well, I had no idea when I was leaving school as to what I was going to go into, but obviously because of my abilities with maths and science and so forth, it was going to be engineering or science. And I was playing golf one day with a fellow about 3 weeks before I left school, and he said, "Right, kid, what are you going to do when you leave school?" I'll never forget, that was on the 9th fairway at East Hills Golf Club. And I said, "Well, science, engineering." He said, "Have you ever thought about metallurgy?" And I said, "Metal what?" So he said to me, "Well, if you want, come on over to the plant at Regent's Park." There was a 40-acre site there, big site. And he said, "If you're interested, after you have a look around, we could offer you a cadetship." And so I did, because I really had nowhere else to go. I mean, I hadn't sought a job at that stage. It was kind of, last few weeks of school, pretty busy with HSC and all that. And it was about a week after that, my father said, "So what are you going to do when you leave school?" I said, "Don't worry about that, I've got that fixed up." And so there I was. I think I only had about 3 or 4 days off after my last exam, and began work. But, when you, as I said earlier, and this is an important issue, I had no car in those days. My father couldn't buy me a car. I think that's pretty standard practice these days for parents. Couldn't afford to put me through university full time. So although I wanted to do science and engineering, I had to try and figure out a way to do that and make some money to pay my way. And the cadetship, fixed that. But anyway, so I really began studying part-time. And as I moved into the foundry game, I kept studying, and eventually ended up with Comalco and did even more study there. But of course, Comalco being as large as it was, and having come from a small foundry where it was family owned, it's still going, by the way, and it's a fascinating business, but there was nowhere for me to go in that company, career-wise. And although we had a lot of fun, I had to find somewhere where I could pursue a career, so I went to Comalco.
So when you talk about a career, were you looking to eventually reach the heights of management, or what was the intention?
Not so much, but I was working in a small company where you go to work and you do pretty much what you did yesterday. And although we did a great variety of things and manufacture a large range of products in a very large range of metals, there really was nowhere to go. Now, Comalco, I guess after I was there for a little while, suddenly opened up to me. And although I wasn't applying for jobs, I got a call from the general manager HR, and next thing he asked me if I wanted to go to Manila. And I sort of looked around to see if there was someone behind me, because I'd only been with them a year. But they were the sort of opportunities that came up. There were international opportunities and interstate and New Zealand and so forth. So yeah, and then of course it was part of, in those days, CRA, which was part of Rio Tinto. It was the Australian arm, and that was about 30 or 40,000 employees. So you can see, if you really wanted to pursue a career, and once you sort of cotton onto that notion, there are lots of things you can do in a large company. Yeah, it's one of the benefits.
It's quite interesting though how such a long and illustrious career can develop out of a conversation in a golf course with someone you probably had no clue about the industry. And this is one of the things that I find, particularly for people who if I go and say, hey, have you thought about something like metallurgy or any of the trades that I look after, and quite often they say, oh, what I know about plumbing, I know about electricians, I know about bricklayers, but I don't know about any of this stuff. It's very hard to uncover it, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. But of course, these days, kids at school can get work experience, and even if it's only a week working somewhere, they can sort of look at it and say, yep, I like this, or no, that's not for me. I guess what attracted to me, well, I wanted to do something that where I could be active. I didn't really in those days want to sit behind a desk. I guess so. That's what school's all about, and that wasn't particularly appealing. So metallurgy gave me a chance to get around a plant and do things that had a little bit of physicality to them. And as I said, the Babcock site was 40 acres, so you'd cover a bit of territory in a day. And then when I joined Comalco, that particular site was 90 acres. And so it sort of gave me a little bit of that physical activity, and as well as the the thinking. But in those days, of course, I spent all my time on the plant, fixing problems, improving things. Comalco was very aggressive in terms of wanting to improve. And
do you think that's a key part of success, is to be able to have an analytical brain and want to go and drive change?
Yes, you don't think of it when you're 25 or 30, and I guess I was over 30 by the time I kind of realised that I really felt like I had to add value. And I suppose my early approach to management was, well, if I wasn't there, if I took a holiday, for instance, or went off sick, the plant still ran. So when I came back, I better do something to make it better, because otherwise I'm not really earning my keep. And so that was an idea that I kind of had in my head from a very early age. And it was only a couple of years into my time at Comalco, and I was offered the job of remelt superintendent. When I joined the company, I really had no notion of taking that job. It was a fairly, in those days, pretty serious sort of a job in a large part of that particular business at Yonora. But anyway, they appointed me to that job, and suddenly I wasn't dealing only with metals and gas contents, hydrogen absorption and all those sorts of things in aluminium, and different metallurgical problems with the casting processes. I suddenly had the union delegate in my office. Now, nobody in management warned me that was going to happen. And so there I was arguing the point, and well, not so much arguing, because I felt that provided we had both had good intentions, we could do good things together. So I didn't find it adversarial. I found it actually quite enlightening, and I enjoyed that. But at the same time, I came to the realisation that I was your typical engineer, if you like, as a metallurgist, and I really knew nothing about people. So I began to question my right to be a manager of people, because one way or another, I pretty quickly had 160 odd people in my group. And what on earth did I know about them, and what drove them and motivated them? And in those days, although there wasn't heavy industrial issues to contend with, there were issues. There were people who had ambitions and people who didn't, and a great mix. And so when I was about 35, I decided to head off and do an MBA to kind of get my head around the rest of the stuff, the non-metallurgical.
Yeah.
So the challenges grew.
Yeah. So and you made a point there that, you know, some people are motivated and some people aren't. Obviously, you've got a lot of motivation, and that's the drive that's gotten you through your career. How have you confronted people who maybe you've been required to manage that haven't had those motivations, and how would you drive that change or at least manage them?
Very interesting question, and it was a few years later. I'll sort of go backwards. I was probably in my late 30s when the managing director of the smelting division of Comalco asked me the question, how do you motivate people? And I was completely nonplussed. I had no idea. I mean, this was embarrassing because at the time he was offering me the choice of 3 jobs, two of them in New Zealand and one of them in North Queensland, and we're in Melbourne, you know. And I'm thinking, yeah, how do you motivate people? But I came to learn, and I came to realise later that I kind of did this anyway. The reality of it is you can't motivate people except for very short term. You can offer them more money, incentives of other sorts, but what you really got to do is provide an environment where they find their own motivation. Yeah. And so in any environment, and if we go back those few years to when I took over the remelt, there were people who were extremely ambitious. And the problem was that we were not, as a management group, really providing them the challenges that they sought. And so some of the greatest troublemakers in that department found they got their motivation by creating problems for management.
Right.
I mean, that's where do you put your extra energy? You just get up to mischief.
Yeah.
And I didn't do that very well. I didn't like the mischief thing. So I challenged a lot of them to technical challenges. I said, you know, try this different products, if you like, in the casting operation, and gave them different things to try over, you know, a 2-month period, and suddenly their attention focused on that. Now there were those that just came to work and did their job and they were quite happy, so they didn't need a lot more motivation, but the troublemakers needed it.
Yeah.
And suddenly the troublemakers became great contributors, and I thought, wow, that didn't come out of any textbook. That just came from a kind of a notional thing in the back of my head. And I was probably the first superintendent in Comalco, certainly at Yennora, to give the foreman projects, because they used to wander around all day and all night with their hands in their pockets and doing a good job, making sure things were operating properly. But their interest sparked up when I gave them all a project to do on different technical things, and they loved it. They wrote reports and all sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I know from my own experience and the way I grew up, I probably was a little bit too smart by half in some circumstances, and I became that troublemaker myself.
Yeah.
And it's usually you do find that, I think, when you find someone who is they find ways to disrupt. It's usually because they're not engaged enough, and they're not actually picking up the skills that actually they can turn to good rather than evil, for want of a better term.
And they have to find an outlet for their energy.
Yeah.
If it's not coaching the kids' soccer team or netball team or something, then they become a problem sometimes.
Yeah.
So I gave them challenges at work, and that's not to say I didn't have some arguments. But when they had an argument, people yelled at them or whatever, they probably yelled back too. But we all knew at the end of the day where we stood, and they knew I was on their team.
Yeah.
As I learnt a little more over the ensuing years, including that conversation with Carl Stewart in Melbourne, I came to realise you need to motivate people. You've got to. This is part of coming to work as a manager and adding value, not finding problems with people and so forth.
Well, I know. Again, I've had a number of employers say to me that, you know, and I hear this in my own mind from my own father about kids these days, you know, and you know that they don't necessarily always want to turn up. They don't want to engage. They don't want to do as they're told. You know, there's always challenges in managing people, and you know, you and I have had lengthy conversations around leadership, and what's the difference between leadership and management in your view?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the short answer, and that's pretty right, is that, you know, managers do things right, leaders do the right things, and in manufacturing land, we tend to attract managers people who work their way into management roles because there's underlings to another manager. They've learned how to do a particular task, and when their boss retires or leaves or something, they take over the role and they say to themselves, well, I know what to do that won't cause any eruptions, this is what I'll do. Manufacturing also attracts people that I'll categorise, if you like, probably unfairly, but in a generalistic way, ISTJ types. These are people who follow rules. Everything's black or white. One of the problems with unionism or unionised environments is that as a manager you automatically take the side of management and you're anti-union or anti the shop floor. You can't do that. If you really want to add value, and this, as I said to you, this became an issue for me at an early age. When I realised that if I went on holidays, nothing changed. They didn't really need me there every day to tell them what to do. Yeah. So I used to go out and say to them, well, as a manager or even as a metallurgist, you're doing this particular job, how can I help you? Mm. And I actually, when I joined a company called Yorkshire Plumbing Fittings, I sat the managers down who reported to me. I was operations director, and I said, listen, this isn't a one-way street, it's a two-way street, and you have a right to expect something from me. Mm-hmm. It's a contract that works both ways. So.
And how did you find that? Because I know you've worked in large and smaller organisations. How do you find getting and communicating that from, the boardroom all the way down to the shop floor to get those people driven?
Well, very often you can't do it from the boardroom because the board's not really all that smart anyway. So in my early days, I did it as a manager. I mean, I just did it because it was good for me and my department. Yeah. And very often I found, and this is where you really have to confront some conflict, perhaps with the management team. But I would find I was a lone voice. So again, looking at Yorkshire, when I told them that they had a right to expect something from me, I also challenged them in that very same meeting to come back the next day and tell me how they were going to find 20% of their time to work on what I call growth work, in other words, improvement work. So I said to them, you can give me a day a week, or you can give me 2 hours a day, or whatever, but you come back and tell me how you're going to do that. And so the production manager came next day and told me how he was going to give me 20% or more of his time by casting off jobs that he really shouldn't have been doing. Yeah. They should have been done further down the line. And so away we went, and we started growing and doing things, despite the fact the rest of the company wasn't. Yeah.
So just to
you live with that. There's conflict there.
Just to touch on that point about people and the load that they take on, and sometimes this is a behavioural thing. Whether that's about being wanted to be seen to be doing more than what you should be, or it's just about lack of trust in the team. Mm-hmm. How would you manage that? Because we quite often have had this conversation about the company owner who goes and does the delivery of a late product, when in reality that's a waste of resources. Yes. How would you deal with that?
Well, the best way is by example. This production manager at Yorkshire came back and he said to me, he said, look, I write out all the purchase orders for all the manufacturing departments. So the various leading hands or whatever they were in those days, foremen, come in and they tell me what they want, and I write the purchase order out. This is before you probably did it. These days you do it on a computer. But anyway, so Mark said to me, I've given that back to them. They get the purchase order book. They have to fill it out, and I sign it off. And he said, I can make a day, a week out of that. A spare time, that is, out of that by passing it back, and back to where it should be. So a short answer to your question is to actually do what you're talking about. Yeah. And so once Mark gave me a day a week, in fact it turned out to be quite a lot more than that, and the other guys as well, we started to do things that people felt and could see the benefits of. Yeah. And I'll never forget, there was, in that particular company, I had to close down a section. It wasn't their fault. The product wasn't succeeding in the marketplace. And the union delegate came to me and he said, look, just do the right things and everything will be okay. And they'd had, in fact, he brought in a union organiser who had given, in those days, Borg Warner an awful time, really bad time. Nick Allen was his name, and when he came in and sat down, he said, I hear you're doing great things, just do the right thing here and everything will be okay.
Yeah.
So we paid people off, and as we should have, and we got on with it. But that same union delegate in the company, when the production manager talked to me about him, he said, you can see how it's going out there because Rod's 2 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
He's just so happy with the positiveness in the business.
Yeah.
And so you've got to show, lead by example. If you can't just say the words, you've got to do it, and you've got to be seen to be doing it. And I always made a point of being out there on the floor for enough time that people could talk to me.
Yeah.
Anyone.
Yeah.
It's their right to know.
And how personal would that get? I know you've said to me in the past that you'd had times when you've walked through the factory and talked to people.
Yeah.
Can you give any examples of how you dealt with that?
Oh, well, I always stopped.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I was concerned, they have a right to know. You can't sit in an office and just send out memos, okay, or bits of paper or instructions. And so if you decide on a particular course of action, I always welcome them stopping me as I walk through the plant and asking questions about it. And again, I would also say to them, so what can I do to help you better understand this or better do your job? And when they saw that I was on their side, trying to make their lives better, they reacted very positively.
Yeah.
I didn't find it hard at all.
Yeah. Now, I know from my experience, generally when the communication channels are open and it's explained as to why we're doing what we're doing, not just saying do it because we're paying you to do it, you get a totally different response.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But you've got to be careful how you do it. I mean, we would decide these things in meetings, and the people who needed to know first would know first, but then I expected them to send the message out to their people, and within a day or so you could go out and answer questions. Yeah. Without undermining the authority of somebody in between.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful how you do that.
Yeah, yeah.
But I encouraged it very much. And I can remember in a larger metal company up in Newcastle, there was a terrible conflict there with the union. And one of the union delegates there made a statement at a meeting that it's a two-sided equation. And I asked him to come and see me and talk to me about that. And he didn't trust me because I wasn't that long in the company. And anyway, I found him on the shop floor a few times and said, Phil, you've got to come and talk to me. Anyway, he came up one afternoon and we had a great session and we broke the barriers. Yeah. He could see I was on their team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What about mentors? I know you're saying a lot of this sort of come a little bit naturally to you. Did you have anyone that you looked up to and drove some of what you did?
I never had a mentor, and I'm very, on reflection, that was probably a gap, if you like. But I found in my early days in manufacturing, it was very autocratic. I was very timid, I suppose, in many ways. I always figured that the boss was my boss because he knew better than I did. So you'd just say, yes, sir, three bags full and so forth. But I did. There were a couple of people early in my career that I looked up to and I listened to and watched. One of them was my boss in Comalco, my immediate boss, and the other one was in Comalco as well. He was the managing director, and I filled in for somebody managing the remelt actually, while this fellow was on about a 3-month holiday. And as I got to know the managing director better, I found that he respected what I was doing. And when this 3-month period came to an end, we all left a meeting one day. We used to have a weekly management meeting, and he said, "Can you just hold on a moment?" We sat at the table, and he said, "Thank you very much for your effort. It was really appreciated." And I thought that was really good. Yeah. But I mean, I talked to him at management meetings, and if I saw him around, but he sat down at the lunch table in the canteen with us doing drawings and things. So it was pretty easy to see that we were both on the same team. I wasn't there just to do what he told me to do. He was listening to me about the problems I had running a department, and contributed. So participating, working together. Yeah.
So, with the lack of mentors, how about mentees? Have you had any experience in that area?
Yeah, probably a lot more. Yeah, well, it's definitely a lot more. Yes, I've done quite a lot of mentoring of employees, but also, I guess more recently, even with students from Western Sydney University. Yeah. I used to get invited before I moved up here to adjudicate their final year projects where they'd have to get out the front of an audience and give a talk. And one way or another, the lecturers introduced me as being able to help them in their careers, and I was very fortunate that some of them followed that up. In fact, through LinkedIn, I sent one a message the other day, because you get the message that he's been there 3 years or something, and I sent him a congratulations, and he responded again. Yeah, quite a few. Yeah, I enjoy that very much. Yeah.
Did they always follow your guidance and advice?
No, and they don't have to.
Yeah.
And I don't tell them any singular thing that they should do. They have to make decisions. In this particular case I was talking about which company. He had a couple of job offers going, or he was unhappy where he was, so he could have stayed there, and he had a job offer on the table. The question is, should he take it, and if he takes it, what should he look for out of that job? If it's just jumping ship, then that's not really adding any value. So he sat down and thought about what he was going to get out of the new company that would help him grow his own career. So in many ways the decision became his own, but I got him to think about that at least. And this is what this was all about. He sent me a message. Well, the message from LinkedIn was that he'd been there 3 years.
Oh, that's good.
It's good that he's still there.
Yeah.
And it's good that he still remembers me, and vice versa. Yeah.
Now, what about challenges as far as policy is concerned? Quite often I go and talk to companies, and they talk about the government not helping and so on. And we've had lengthy conversations in the past about some previous government policies. What have been the highlights over your career, or the lowlights, if you like? Either way, I don't mind. About what has happened in the past and what maybe should happen in the future.
Yeah, as you rise through the ranks, and provided you're an independent thinker, and given that as I rose through the ranks, I started to do things which made big changes in companies, and that started way back in 1990, for instance, was an experience. You begin to realise there's more out there that's not happening. So instead of just looking backwards, you begin to look forwards. And in fact, this is a part of growing as a leader. Leaders don't tell people what to do, but the first thing they do is they look for problems. So they become problem identifiers. And as you look further afield and your world gets bigger, you begin to look at government and federal governments, because they're presiding over all of Australia. So some of in the 90s, early 90s, I was a partaker of some government programs, funding programs, and as I got stuck into that and I was becoming more and more independent and doing my own leadership stuff, I became a critique, or I began to critique the government's approach. And so these days I find my attention is so broad. I mean, as you develop, you really can't go backwards. I couldn't go back and run a department anymore, because my interest is much broader than that. So I need to be somewhere doing things which are improving the company, but also where I've got one foot in those circles where you participate with government and you offer your advice whether they want it or not. You can't sit quietly under a rock just taking. You've got to give back. And you do that by being part of various forums, by offering opinions. And I suppose in terms of disappointments, to answer that part of your question, I still see the Australian government not doing what's been required for well over 30 years. A couple of years ago I did a literature review as part of a doctorate, and I went back to some reports in 1986 where the government, or the Australian Manufacturing Council, was extolling the need for Australia, this is 1986 remember, to actually develop better leadership skills in manufacturing, and to begin manufacturing greater value-added product. Well, in the mid-80s that was very relevant, but there's still the same message out there now, and we haven't done anything. And that's hellishly disappointing. That's 35 years or something. And I don't see the government doing much now. There's more money being headlined, 1.5 billion and all the rest of it, but I'm not sure how much of that's going to be taken up by the manufacturers. We still don't have a manufacturing strategy in this country. We should compare ourselves there with Germany and even Singapore, and a number of European countries. I mean, a change of government would probably reverse all of that. A new government would look at that 1.5 billion and say, we can save that. and take it away again.
So what would be the solution to this?
We need some long-term strategies that aren't going to be changed by alternating governments. There has to be a constancy to it. It might be just moulded a little bit round the fringes as we change parties over the years, but we need to decide that we're either going to be manufacturers or we're not. Now, Germany has certainly decided that they will, and it won't matter who's in government. I'm sure they'll keep going the same direction. They've moulded their university system around it. Engineering is an admired profession in not only Germany but in Europe. You actually put the title in front of your name, ING, to signify that you're a professional engineer. We don't care out here. I mean, we've got a need now for engineering skills, but we don't pay people appropriately. We don't really provide them career paths. If you're lucky enough to get in with a big company, you might have a career, but we're not doing enough to promote these skills in the greater population.
So obviously we're still in the pandemic with COVID, but there's been some view, particularly when national border closures happened, and there was some view that this might reignite manufacturing in Australia. Do you think there's enough being done to drive that sort of turning of the tide, maybe reshoring particularly those products that are in the national interest to get that happening here?
Well, basically no. I think once the pandemic is over and we're managing it, and eventually we'll find cures or vaccines or whatever, I think the urgency disappears, and if it's not right in front of you, people will tend to forget about it. They'll still grab the cheapest product, which is probably going to be imported. No, it's got to be bigger than that. And really, we're talking about, say, face masks or something. That's not an elaborately transformed product. It's a very simple product. It's not something you'd want your kid to build a career on, becoming a professional in an organisation which makes paper masks. You need something bigger than that.
So that goes to the case of innovation and whether we have the entrepreneurship and the innovation and the drive to create new products, and creating a space in this country to sail those ships, if you like, around new products, new design, new thinking, new design. You've obviously got the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre that's been funded by the federal government, and they've got a lot of participants who are trying to now participate with universities around innovation, and they basically work on a marketing type model, saying, have you done all the science behind it? Is it ready for market? And how can we help you get it to market? Do you think there's enough being done by the AMGC, for that matter, to push that?
Well, everything, look, I'm pleased to see that sort of thing happening. One of the issues there is, however, some of this product development can take years. We do some wonderful research in CSIRO and at universities, but I've been in R&D. I work with Comalco in R&D. It can take 10 years to develop a product or a technology. So you don't immediately see the benefit. You don't suddenly wake up one day and discover or think up a new product. But in any case, the other part of that I find very worrying is that this innovation thing, and even the entrepreneurship thing, tends to be very product-centric. And look, for 30-odd years, and you and I have talked about this, I've held the belief that innovation is one thing, but being innovative is what you want your company to be.
Yeah.
So it's not just the product that you want to sell for $10 or $10,000, whatever it is. It's the way you take it to market. It's the way you treat your people. Do they really get a chance? Are they invited to contribute to better accounting systems, for instance? I really don't see anywhere near enough advancement in managing people. I'm a stern critic, I'm afraid, and I'll upset some people here, but of the HR profession, because I still think they're impersonal. They don't. There's kind of two sides to it. There's the bit of just managing people and paying them and making sure that conflicts are resolved, But the other side of it is, how do you develop your people so that they become independently innovative and entrepreneurial within the company?
Yeah.
Okay, so how do they? I just don't see enough of that. Now, I've worked in large and small companies. In small companies, the HR function gets handed to the finance manager. The finance manager couldn't be more removed from people than he or she is in finance. This is about domain skills, and let me tell you, the accounting domain skills are very different to those domain skills in what I call people management and leadership.
Yeah.
So I still think there's a long way for that HR profession to go, but if you want an innovative company, it has to start with your people.
Yeah.
It has to be the soft side of the business, not just the hardware.
So,
And product development, that might be 2 people in a room in a company with 100 other people. What are the other 98 doing?
Yeah. So, and I guess that brings up the question about what the things are that HR and that drive around skills, and that's a core thing for me is, what skills do people require? Quite often we're hearing about what is being described as a gap in speed to market of skills for companies that are growing or have to be innovative.
Yeah.
My experience has been generally there's not too much new under the sun. It's how it's packaged and how it's delivered, and whether there is a driver on either side. So whether it's a pull or a push type market. Have you got any thoughts on that at all?
Well, pardon me for saying it this way, but what you've just described to me is in my mind, at least, I picture what you're saying to me as a stepwise process. A company is rolling along for some time, might be years or whatever, and suddenly decides it needs a new skill. It could be in IT, and they'll go out and buy it, or they, if you're lucky, they'll actually pay for somebody to go off to university and learn those skills. So, but once you've acquired them, that's it. That stops. So it's a stepwise increment. Something I had to think about hard in the very early 90s was whether or not I just train people for a specific job every so often, or whether I actually build an environment where they're all learning all the time.
Yeah.
So learning was a way of being. And actually there's literature out there now that talks about leading or learning as a way of leading. So what you really want is your organisation learning all the time.
Yeah.
And you just never know when the skills that they're picking up or what their learnings will be applied.
Yeah.
I did a talk a few years ago in Parramatta, and another speaker was working with me, and he talked about 3D printing. And someone in the audience said, "How do you start with that?" Well, that was the very day, it was a Wednesday, that Aldi had a brochure out saying, "Come and buy a 3D printer for $400 or $300." So I said to this guy, "Buy yourself a $300 3D printer, put it in the lunchroom, and let them play with it, even if they make things for home." Because as they learn how to use it, $300 isn't much, is it? As they learn to use it, they will find ways and means of using it at work.
Yeah.
But why would you wait, say, for another 5 years when suddenly you've got to catch up by buying a 3D printer?
Yeah.
You should be acquiring those skills all the time. And in the people side of the equation, I like to see the company building skills all the time.
Yeah.
And one way you can do it, particularly in management, is that you, as a metallurgist, you wouldn't work for your lifetime in metallurgy. You might work in HR for a while. Okay, so there's a skill that you're picking up, and if you're halfway intelligent, you'll be critiquing what you're seeing as you're working in that area, and making a contribution. And you might move out after a couple of years. You might move out of that into engineering design, okay, and finance and so forth. So you're actually, in many ways, in your career, following almost an MBA path, but you're applying it all the time. Too often I see people being promoted up a straight line. They're, as a metallurgist or as an engineer, they're good at their job, so they become the manager, and then they become a general manager, but the problem is they're still thinking like an engineer as a general manager. Whereas they really ought to be able to scan the whole company and make a contribution everywhere.
So how much of that is based on, you're talking about ISTJs and those sorts of things, which is a Myers-Briggs type model of psychology, I suppose. how much of that effort is being put in within industry to sort of identify the right people for the right jobs, and can you change someone who's got a personal archetype like that into someone that can have a more humanities focus if they're hard engineering wired?
Yeah. Well, you really, if you think about large companies, and Rio Tinto thinks like this, you will have different divisions. If you wanted to be an engineer for a lifetime in a company like Rio, you could pursue that engineering career and end up as at managing director level, because they will have an independent engineering group, and it could be 500 people in size. Okay, so if you wanted to be an accountant all of your life, you'd be in a similar group within that large company. We're talking about 100,000 employees. That's all about finance. So you can specialise. About 1984, I remember Sir Roderick Carnegie giving a talk to the Managing Directors Conference in CRA, or Rio Tinto, and he simply said that perhaps the most important person in our whole organisation of 100,000 people is the geologist going out walking around Australia with a pick and a backpack, what do you call it, a backpack, and looking for our next iron ore deposit.
Yeah.
So that person, if he wants to do that for a lifetime, should be rewarded with a career path in that area. But if you really want to run a business unit, you will have to make that decision yourself. You're not forced, but your own personal curiosity will, if you're running like I was a department, so the remelt department, and I've been used to the metallurgy there, and the union delegate comes in and starts talking about other things, I'm either curious or I'm not.
Yeah.
If I'm not, I'm going to be adversarial. But I was curious and I wanted to know what his problem was, because I figured it was my job to help him solve it, provided it was worth solving.
Yeah.
So you find your own path. You're not told.
Yeah.
You either want to pursue that broader perspective or you don't.
And if we were to provide similar advice to people who are in a smaller organisation, an SME, which is pretty much the norm in manufacturing these days, how would they apply that sort of logic?
Well, sadly, they probably have to change organisations, and I'm not saying every year, but you probably think in terms of 3 to 4 year stints. So you've been working for a particular company, perhaps as an electrical engineer. You may have contributed as much as you're ever going to contribute, really. It's just more of the same. If you stay there, you have to make up your own mind that whether or not you want to go and do other things. But if you're of that curious nature, you've probably been doing something postgraduate anyway to find your way, like an MBA.
Yeah.
And you'll sort of say to yourself, well, I really don't want to be an electrical. As much as I loved it, I didn't want to be a metallurgist forever. I still love molten metal. But I had a curiosity for other things.
And what's your view of MBAs these days? Is it all it's cracked up to be? Because I know it's been for about the last 20 years, MBAs have been the thing. Yeah. Do you think that they are still the thing?
There's been a question mark over that all the time that I've been involved. I mean, I started in '85, and the MBAs came in for a lot of criticism then. I think as a baseline, you can't go backwards if you do an MBA. I mean, even if you're an engineer and you do an MBA and you still remain an engineer, you've kind of looked over the fence and decided that's not what you want. You don't want to be a business manager, you want to remain in engineering. But you'll be a better engineer, I believe, because if nothing else, you'll appreciate the financial side. And hopefully in doing your engineering development work, you'll apply things like net present value analysis and so forth, and you'll want to investigate the marketplace rather than just come up with another mousetrap which you find's already been patented anyway. But no, an MBA certainly won't do you any harm. I've had a lot of people come to me and ask advice on an MBA, and I'll say to them, well, if it's doing its job, it'll make you unhappy. And the reason it'll make you unhappy is because you will begin to see how much better it all could be. And if that stimulates you... I
don't think that's in the marketing brochure for MBAs.
No, it's not. It's not. But your own personal ambitions and curiosity and your own energy will sort of cause a ruction in the way you do things, and you'll go off to do it better. It can't do any harm. You don't have to do an MBA to do that, but it's a great start. It certainly can light a fuse. Yeah. It did for me, but then I went and did a whole lot more after that as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, I don't know if there's anything that I sort of tried to capture as much as we generally could.
Yeah.
Maybe just what were the qualifications after you did your MBA? What did you go on to after that?
Well, as I did the MBA, two things sort of jumped out off the page for me, or perhaps three. In terms of subject matter, I had a keen interest in people. So I found subjects about leadership and HR and even the history of union conflict in this country. Previously, I would have just thought it was all it was nothing more than a union problem. But I came to realise that the management side of the business wasn't all that great either. So there were less.
Takes two sides to tango, doesn't it?
Takes two to tango. So I found that very interesting, and the other thing that I found interesting as a metallurgist was finance, because I just felt the guys who'd done accounting degrees were just had that bit more knowledge than I did. So even before I finished the MBA, I undertook a Masters in Applied Finance to learn just that bit more about finance. And it wasn't to become a trader. I just wanted to be able to argue with the accountants more, from a more informed perspective. And boy, did I buy some arguments after that. But I found the accounting profession was extremely lacking in finance understanding. So I tended to look at the company and ask myself, in what financial way can we improve the business? And so, if you're doing product development and it's not going to add some more value to the company, better change track, okay? The other thing was that, in those days, I took a role in 1990, which certainly challenged me on a leadership level. This company was reacting to tariff reductions, and so we undertook a strategic planning exercise, and it's very mechanical, and this is one of the reasons I'm a bit critical of today's government, if you like, but an Industry 4.0 and all the rest of it, because this strategy thing was what I'd call technical. We did all the right things technically. We got it horribly wrong, but that was just part of the learning process. But once we kind of got it horribly righter, we lacked the ability to put it into action, because people were used to being told what to do.
Yeah.
And as I went round and I discovered people could not enact what they promised to do, I began to realise we were lacking in leadership, and that's when I personally confronted my own leadership in about 1990, and I decided I had to learn something about becoming a leader. And so all the other things I did were really following that leadership thing. And I found that most postgraduate courses, like Masters of Commerce and Business and so forth, tend to just teach from a textbook. It's almost mechanical, and it's very sad. But I wanted to go right to the bottom of the heart of leadership, what it is, not only what it is, but how do you get it? And so I found that no university in Australia could teach you all of that, and so I had to do postgraduate things at one university in organisation behaviour, and then I did another thing in management psychology, still looking for for what was right at the bottom of this mine shaft. The last thing I did was in the Faculty of Education, because I went looking for some sort of answers around how adult people learn. I mean, if the pundits out there agree, and the academics do, that leadership can be learned, then what do I do as a manager in my organisation to provide those learnings for my management team, so that we end up with leaders, not just managers?
Yeah.
And so I had to pursue all of those things in different universities, which is sad. There's no university in Australia will give you that full depth.
But it's interesting, that you've taken a full career to gather that education. It's not something that you could actually capture at the beginning, or even to the point at where you became the GM or the CEO of a company, that you would have that knowledge at hand and have a good enough grasp on it to apply it in a way that actually is going to make it tangible.
Well, yeah, most companies, very few companies have that knowledge within their own boundaries. CRA or Rio Tinto used to, but they had a small team of very senior executives. I mean, I'm talking about very senior, and they talked to the world's leading experts and came up with, and also used people like McKinsey's and so forth, and they got close to understanding how you develop leadership or leaders. And that's why I mentioned earlier, in large companies, an engineer or a metallurgist can transgress the boundaries of his own profession, and in fact in Rio Tinto you will not get to the top unless you've gone across a number of boundaries. You don't go straight up the ladder, you have to climb a very long hill, and you'll probably have to, in a company of that size, work in maybe 3 or 4 different businesses, and some of them might have to be overseas just to get that experience. Well, no, that's a bad word. I shouldn't say experience. To be subjected to the events in your life that can turn you into a leader. Yeah. So there's a self-awareness has to happen here. It's through reflection on those events and so forth that you'll grow. Yeah. And small companies very difficult. Big companies like Rio, yeah.
And we'd had those conversations about self-reflection, about developing and so on, and what those key pivotal moments are in your life and your career. And it's not just that your working life; it's your personal realisation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that's where I was coming at before with the the difference between managers and leaders. And, because a lot of the management stuff is mechanical, whereas the leadership stuff is more organic in a lot of ways.
Very much, and sadly, because of in manufacturing, there are people who only see things as black or white. If you wanted to sit down and philosophise about the management of your company, you'd find you wouldn't have an audience. Nobody wants to listen to that in manufacturing. So you have to go outside and participate in some of these forums and sort of wax lyrical with other people who are beginning to understand some of that stuff, and you and I have done a bit of that. That's where the learning comes from. You can't find it just within your company. No, probably not.
So at the moment you're sort of semi-retired, I guess, is the state of play. What do you see in your future? Do you see there's opportunities to work with companies still and provide them with advice?
The answer is yes, but that's less about being retired or whatever. It's more about whether companies out there want to learn. And there's the problem in this country. Without it's like any strategy. Somebody could put the star on the wall or hang the star out at night and say that's where we're shooting for. And the government's not doing it, and it's not happening in most of our I could almost say none of our manufacturing companies. There might be a few. I don't know them all, but somebody's got to turn a light on and say, "There's the star we're aiming for." It's a long way away, and it's going to be a tortuous journey getting there. And we need people out there who will say, "Well, I'm going to take that journey. It's going to mean some personal pain, sacrifice, time, all the rest of it. But gee, that's a wonderful trip to take.
Well, I think journey." The only person that I can think of, even internationally. And you may or may not agree, is Elon Musk, and he's an entrepreneur and he's a prolific reader, and there's a few people in the world that are like that, but I don't know too many of them live in Australia, and too many of them that are being listened to by Australian manufacturers. So
absolutely,
it is a challenge, isn't it?
Well, that's why I think it's got to start with government, and I've often pondered this: how do you actually? Where would the government start? Well, it's not just funding, which is sort of lying over there on the table, and you've got to go through, 1,000 hoops to access. There has to be an energy behind it, and I don't quite know all the answers here, but I've often pondered whether or not we shouldn't put in some rules around running companies. For instance, if you're going to run a company of $10 million turnover or more, should you have a license issued by some government department that says, we think you're qualified because you've done X, Y, and Z? Now, that could be an MBA, but it could also be sitting just some sort of test or going through some sort of program that the government's running before you get your license. A bit like, the RTO type approach. But, if you're going to run a company of 10 million turnover or 20 million, you're going to have people. You're going to be responsible for people, their superannuation, their welfare. If the company's going down the gurgler, how are you going to protect their superannuation, for instance? Are you going to be able to pay all your taxes? So your mind needs to be able to come outside of the organisation to see how you contribute to society.
Yeah. I wonder if the ethics are there though now to drive that sort of behaviour, or whether it's, you know, as this ship sinks, I jump onto another ship.
Yeah, well, I think that's more what we've seen in my time. Yeah, but anyway, I don't know. I mean, that'd be a fascinating topic to sit down with the right people and discuss for a day or two even, and see where it could be taken to.
Yeah.
But you know, we need to do something. Just an interesting aside, I used to do some work with Western Sydney University, and I went along one night where the better presentations were being presented to a larger audience to give the students a bit of practice. But just before the show started, we were having drinks and hors d'oeuvres. It was all very nice, and I was talking to one young fellow who was probably only about 22. And the university, and much to their credit for this, had sent 22 students to Singapore. What a fantastic experience for someone of that age, where they got to mix with people who senior manufacturing types. Anyway, this young fellow said to me, I said, well, what did you discover in Singapore? He said, well, I found out that the Singaporean government has a strategy for manufacturing. So I said, well, do you think that would be a good idea here in Australia? He said, definitely yes. Yeah. So they have a strategy that's ongoing, no matter who's in government. And that's, I think, a good lesson for us to.
So it seems like there's something emerging at the moment, and I'm not sure if you've seen in my latest newsletter. I think I might have put it in there, that there is a manufacturing, advanced manufacturing strategy coming out of at a national level. It may have been the one before, but again, I'm not so sure that it has the meat on the bones that's going to drive a lot of the stuff that we really need. And having said that, it's one thing to have a strategy for growth for manufacturing and bring that stuff back on shore, but I know plenty of companies already that can't find the talent. They can't even find the people with the interest to develop the talent in this country, which is a major problem. So it's a very large ship to turn around, in my view.
Is that real though? Can't find the talent?
Well, I think it's there are other things drawing people away.
I think that's more the point.
So it isn't attractive enough at the moment to get them on board until there is a fully wedded approach to the future of manufacturing in this country. Mums and dads aren't going to want to drive their sons and daughters into our industry, and even to the extent, we've spoken with Sydney University and others around aeronautical engineering, and most of those people end up in banking, unfortunately, mainly because there is not an industry that's burgeoning in this country, because there's not the impetus by the government to provide that space to engage it.
So I think you've answered the question the way I would. I don't think it's a talent deficiency. I think the talent's always there. It's just which way is it directed. And what we've got to do at the national level, and that means government, we've got to provide the right sort of environment. These people will find, as I said before, about motivation. People will find their motivation in the right environment. Now, if they're watching television and then watching programs like LA Law and all the rest of it, well, they'll go off and do law. The problem is they can't get a job. I know law graduates who are teaching primary kids at school. Just not enough. But it all looks very glamorous on TV. We've got to make manufacturing glamorous, and we've got to pay well. Manufacturing does, but it's got to continue to pay well. Certainly better than a barista would earn, for instance, or a taxi driver.
Well, we might leave it. We've been going for an hour, and this is the first kick-off of what I'm going to try to do. And it's been great ranging conversation, and like I said, I'll share it back to you before I do anything with it, just so that you can say, well, this is right, that's not, or whatever. And if you lose confidence in me, tell me, and we'll move away.
With all the confidence in the world.
So that's the first one, and we'll see how we go.